Now, did you know that it's possible to get NavMesh links? Did you know that it was possible to get nav meshes to be able to move? So usually what So before I learned about this, I thought NavMesh agents So before I learned about this, I thought nav meshes were purely static. So the way I was dealing with them before was I would actually go into So the way I was dealing with them before was I would attach a NavMesh surface to a static object, and then I would just basically bake it as usual. So in this case, what I did was I put all the static environment objects within this particular static environment layer, and then I would use this to bake. So what would happen before is there's no NavMesh, and then I would bake like this. Now you can see when I clear and bake, it doesn't affect this guy, because this guy has its own separate NavMesh that can also move. So you can see that this rig has this separate NavMesh surface, but it has a slightly different object collection policy. So in the stationary one, we can see that object collection says all game objects as long as it's within this specific layer. Now I wanted this particular layer to be able to move separately. So we can see that its layer is default, which means that it gets ignored by this NavMesh surface policy, because this only has the static environment. But also, when it does the baking, it also doesn't bother the rest of the scene because we're saying current object hierarchy. So basically what that means is it only cares about the children or the objects that are within this rig. So the top level rig of this, or the top level object of this rig, is an empty game object, which is essentially just a management thing. And the rest of it is just a bunch of static geometry. Just a bunch of geometry. So when I clear it, it only clears the NavMesh for this guy, and then when I bake it, it bakes the NavMesh for this guy. And because it's attached to this particular object, I can actually just move this around. So the NavMesh surfaces are actually attached to the objects that you've attached them to. So even the stationary platform, if we bake this again, would actually still follow the whole stationary platform. But that's a little bit weird because we only moved the stationary platform. We didn't move the office object, which it also used as a basis for baking. So if we were to move both of these objects, then we can see that the whole thing moves with it. Okay, one more thing about nav meshes or nav mesh surfaces. We can actually change the policy of how it's baking. So what we can do is we can go edit this particular agent. So what we can do is we can edit the agent types that it deals with. So if we do this drop down and say open agent settings, we can change the assumption of the NavMesh baking. And we can see that this is currently using a radius of 0.1. I think by default, this value is much bigger. So let's say 0.5. And what this does is it makes it a little bit less generous on the buffer zones of where it's doing the baking. So let's have a look at the effect of that. Just clear and then bake. So we can see that the margins are a lot bigger. So if we didn't want that to be big, so if we didn't want that to be much bigger, for reasons like I wanted this bridge to be much closer to the edge, then we just go ahead and change the agent settings, and then we can change the radius like so, and then bake again. Okay, I didn't want to make this video too long. That's it for now. Thanks for watching.